it comes to an easy knit, you really can't go wrong with garter stitch, but sometimes you want something that's easy to knit but is a little bit more interesting to look at and to feel than just plain garter stitch. And that's where I think this blanket might be the one for you. I've called this design Henry. It's a really simple blanket to knit. There is no pattern multiple to this blanket, and it's a 10-row repeat, and 9 of those 10 rows are just garter stitch. But somehow the one row that we changes the blanket from just really simple garter stitch into something that is filled with texture and just feels amazing to squish, which ultimately is what you want when you're knitting a baby blanket. To knit this blanket, you are going to need 400 grams of double knit yarn. For those of you not based in the UK, that is also known as 3-weight yarn and light worsted weight yarn. You are going to need a set of circular needles. 4mm is the size that you're looking for if you're using the same weight yarn as me, and you're going to want a set of needles about 80 to 100 centimeters long to accommodate all of your stitches. You are also going to need some embroidery scissors to cut your yarn and sort your ends. And to make your borders really nice and visible when you're knitting, you're going to need 2 stitch markers just to mark where your side border ends and your middle textured panel starts. So without further ado, grab some yarn, grab some needles, and let's get knitting. As I mentioned in the intro, there is no pattern multiple for this blanket, so you just want to cast on as many stitches as you feel that you need to achieve the width of blanket that you want. That being said, for my blanket that's about 60 centimeters wide, I cast on 132 stitches. I like to use the long tail cast on for all of my blankets, but you can use whichever cast on method you feel comfortable with. The first part of the blanket that we want to knit is the bottom garter stitch edging, and for this bottom garter stitch edging you are going to knit 16 rows in exactly the same way. So you start by knitting every single stitch until you have 1 stitch left on your left hand needle to work. So just knit all the way across until you are left with just 1 stitch left to work. Instead of knitting this final stitch, we are going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front, and the way that I do this is to pop the yarn to the front of my work by just popping it over my right hand needle and holding it in place, and then I'm going to pop my needle into that final stitch as if to purl, so from right to left and not from left to right, because you don't want to twist the stitch. So you're going to pop your needle in from right to left, slip it over onto your right hand needle, and then once it's firmly on you can take out your left hand needle, and then don't forget to pop your yarn to the front of your work so that you don't accidentally create a new stitch. So what you now want to go away and do is knit another 15 rows exactly like that one. So you're going to knit all the way across and slip the final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front, and once you've completed those 16 rows we're going to be ready to move on to the textured section of our blanket. After your 16th row, this is what your work should look like, and this side with this smooth side of the cast on edge is the side that we are going to class as the right side of our work. So the first row that we work after this bottom edging is actually a setup row, just to get our stitch markers in place ready for when we go into the 10-row repeat that you're going to work for the rest of the blanket. Our setup row is worked on the wrong side of the work, so the first row that you work after the edging is going to be a wrong side row, and you're starting that row by knitting the first 9 stitches. Once you've knit 9 stitches, you want to grab the first of your 2 stitch markers and pop it onto your right hand needle. This marks one side of our garter stitch border. Next, you want to purl all the way across until you have 9 stitches left to work on your left hand needle. Every other stitch until then is a purl stitch. Just like at the other end of the row, when you have 9 stitches left to work on this left hand needle, you are going to grab the second of your stitch markers and then just pop it onto your right hand needle to mark the opposite side garter stitch border, and then you are going to knit the next 8 stitches. The final stitch, just like with our bottom garter stitch border, you are going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front. And that's our setup row complete. Now it's time to jump into the main 10 row repeat that you are going to work for the rest of the blanket until it is the size that you want it to be and you feel ready to add on the top edge. And the first 9 rows of that 10 row repeat are worked in exactly the same way as your bottom garter stitch border. Just as a recap, you are going to knit every single stitch with the exception of the final stitch. You want to slip your stitch markers across as you come to them. And then for that final stitch of the row, you want to slip that purlwise with the yarn in front to keep giving us that nice braided edge that we get up our long edges. So you're going to work 9 rows in exactly that way. Knit every stitch with the exception of the final stitch, and that final stitch you're going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front. 9 rows should leave you with a piece of work that looks like this. You should be able to count 4 garter stitch ridges after that first purl indent section, and you should have just finished a right side row. So row 10, the last row of our repeat, is a wrong side row. We start row 10 like any other row by knitting the first 9 stitches. Slip the marker over, and then what you want to do is purl all the way across until you hit your second marker. So every stitch until your second marker is a purl stitch. When you hit your second marker, you're going to slip it over, and then you're going to knit the next 8 stitches. And then just like every other row, you are going to slip that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. And that completes row 10. To grow your blanket, what you want to do is go away and knit these 10 rows over and over until your blanket is about 5 centimeters shorter than you want it to be. In the case of the blanket that I showed you in the introduction, I repeated rows 1 to 10 a total of 28 times. So you would now go away and repeat them 27 more times if you're making the same size blanket as me. You can work out how many repeats you've done by counting these purl indentations. You ignore the first one because that was our setup row, but every subsequent one will mark the end of a 10 row repeat. So as I said, in my case, I repeated it a total of 28 times before I moved on to the border, but you can repeat it as many or as few times as you need for your size of blanket. When your blanket is about 4 centimeters shorter than the overall length you want your blanket to be, you'll be ready to start your top garter stitch edging. You want to start that edging after you've completed a full repeat of 10 rows. So your last row that you will work before you start your top garter stitch edging will be the row that has the purl stitches in it. To work your top garter stitch edging, you are going to work 16 rows in exactly the same way. So just like with our bottom garter stitch edging, you are going to work across, knitting every single stitch with the exception of the final stitch. On this first row of your edging, you can remove your stitch markers as you come across them because we no longer need to mark our side borders. So if you knit all the way across, and then with that final stitch, instead of knitting it, you want to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. A recap of how to slip that final stitch: you're going to pop your working yarn to the front of your work, however you normally do it. You're going to pop your right hand needle into that final stitch from right to left, and then you're going to slip it off your left hand needle and it should remain on your right hand needle. And then just to finish, if your yarn isn't already at the front of your work, you just lift it over so that you don't accidentally create a new stitch. What you want to go away and do now is knit another 15 rows in exactly this way. Knit every single stitch with the exception of the final stitch, and the final stitch you slip purlwise with the yarn in front. So 15 more rows, which should leave you having worked a total of 16 rows, and you should be just about to start a right side row once you have worked those 16 rows. So your final row, your cast off row, should be with the right side facing you. After your 16th row, you should have the right side of your work facing you, and you should be able to count 8 garter ridges on your border, just like you have 8 garter ridges on your bottom border. And the very last step that we need to work to finish off our blanket is the cast off. The cast off we're going to work for this blanket is a very basic knitted cast off. I'm going to cover it really briefly in this video, but if you need a more in-depth video, then I will link the separate video that I have for the basic cast off here now. But the basic rule of the knitted cast off is that you never have more than 2 stitches on this right hand needle. So you start by knitting the first 2 stitches. Keep your tension nice and relaxed. You don't want it too tight because then your top edge won't lay flat. Once you've got 2 stitches on that right hand needle, you're going to grab the first of those 2 stitches that you knitted with your left hand needle, and you're going to lift it up and over the second stitch and off your needle. So you've gone from 2 stitches down to 1 stitch. So you've cast off 1 stitch. Then you're going to knit 1 more stitch and repeat that process. So lift the first stitch over the second stitch and you go from 2 down to 1, and you repeat that all the way across your row until you have no stitches left on your left hand needle and just have 1 stitch left on your right hand needle. When you have 1 stitch left on this right hand needle, you want to pull it up to make it slightly bigger and take out your knitting needles. We don't need those anymore. At this point you can break your yarn. Make sure to leave a nice long tail, at least 20 centimeters long, so that you can weave in your ends nice and securely. And then with this big loop, what I like to do is to pop the tail of the yarn through the loop and then pull to tighten it all closed. And then once you sew in your end, that's not even visible. And there we have one finished Henry blanket. A couple of final bits and bobs before I go. I often get asked, is a blanket reversible? This blanket is not reversible. The reverse of this blanket looks like this, which you can see just pretty much looks like garter stitch. The purl row puts some of the rows slightly closer together, but all in all, the reverse of the blanket really does just look like garter stitch. Do I have a written pattern? And the answer is yes. I have a free version of the pattern on my website, and on my website is also a link to buy an ad-free PDF if you want to have something that you can print out and take away with you so that you're not sat in front of a screen while you're knitting. And then finally, can this be knit in any weight yarn? The answer is absolutely yes, but you are just going to need to adjust your cast on number to accommodate for whether or not you are using thicker or thinner yarn. But yes, this pattern will work with any weight yarn. That's all from me for today. If you're looking for a slightly more complicated blanket to tackle, then I'll link one up here now, and I'll see you again for another video soon.